137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 3 decks stacked one above another. Those numbers are not a guess. They come straight from the biblical instruction. The title of this video promises untold secrets, but what that really means is this. The Bible gives precise dimensions and a few critical details, and from there we can reasonably imagine how Noah turned divine specification into a seafaring structure large enough to shelter life itself. Today we'll walk the same ground, hear the bite of the axe, and consider how faith met hammers and ropes. We will stay faithful to Scripture where it speaks, and clearly mark what we infer from the building traditions of the ancient Near East. If you want to follow the story beyond the Ark, what happened after they came out, tap the companion video on your screen now. Before any beam was raised, the work began on the land. A vessel of that length and breadth demanded a careful choice of site. The Ark needed a foundation that would hold when the waters rose, and would support enormous loads even while it sat on dry ground. The biblical text gives a clue that becomes important here. In the pre-flood world, moisture behaved differently than it does today. Some passages imply that the earth was more saturated beneath the surface. If that was the case, Noah faced two immediate problems: creating a relatively flat, stable platform and ensuring water would not undermine the structure while he built. A plausible reconstruction begins with soil testing. Imagine Noah, his sons, and a small team walking the shoreline, kneeling to press a finger into the earth, tapping stones, looking for the firm spots. They would dig test pits, feeling the layers with their hands and watching how water behaved. Where the ground was too spongy, they likely cut shallow trenches to divert seepage and laid down compacted beds of small stones and packed clay to spread the load. Simple drainage channels could be dug to lead surface water away. These were not elaborate civil engineering projects by modern standards, but they mattered. A ship that long needs support across a broad footprint. A soft patch under a keel could spell unequal settling and catastrophic stress once the hull took a load. Why cypress? The text names a specific timber. In the ancient Near East, certain woods were prized for resistance to decay and for straight, workable grain. Cypress offers rot resistance and workable beams. Felling trees of the size needed was laborious. Think of axes and wedges, the rhythmic strike, the echo of wood cracking under a well-placed wedge. A single tree suitable for a major beam was a multi-day effort to fell and roughly shape. The ancient world did not rely on powered saws. Work went by muscle, by patience. Plausible reconstruction. Transporting those trunks from forest to build site required the same low-technology ingenuity people have used for millennia.
Wooden rollers, a litter of rounded logs placed under the trunk and moved from rear to front as the log advanced, reduce friction dramatically. Teams of men dragged with thick ropes, using levers to roll a trunk onto the rollers. If the route had small inclines, they controlled descent with rope and capstan systems, where men or animals walked around posts to apply steady braking force. For the largest timbers, sledges padded with wet hide could bear loads over compacted tracks. These are not modern inventions. They are the kinds of methods attested in antiquity. They're a plausible explanation for how Noah could repeatedly move heavy timbers without beasts of burden beyond what the text allows. Neighbors might have laughed at such toil, but the steady cadence of hauling would be a rhythm of faith for Noah and his family. As timber arrived, the next challenge was turning individual trunks into a continuous backbone, the keel. In ships, the keel is the long structural member that runs along the bottom, the spine of the hull. The ark's length exceeded the height at any single tree likely available, so beams had to be joined. Ancient joinery used simple, elegant solutions, scarf joints that overlap two beams, secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-bored holes, tongue and groove connections where a projecting tongue from one beam fits into a groove in its neighbor, and reinforcing clamps carved from the same wood. These joints distribute tension and compression across a long span. Pegs, wooden dowels, swell when wet, helping to tighten a joint. No metal fasteners need be presumed. To align these massive elements, shipwrights used plumb lines, heavy weights on cord, and simple templates to maintain a straight reference line along the keel. Plausible reconstruction. Raising the ribs, the transverse frames that give a hull its curved form, is an exercise in geometry made with hand tools. Ribs are essentially the skeleton's hoops. They set the shape and determine internal volume. The crew would lay out full-scale patterns on the ground, trace each rib's curvature on planks, and then cut them with adzes and chisels. To lift them into place, teams used gin poles, tall, simple A-frames, and block and tackle-like assemblies made from rope and wooden sheaves. Leverage, not power, did the heavy work. Guide ropes held each rib steady as it was set on the keel and braced temporarily with crossbeams. Surveying was basic but effective. Men used level water in a trough, sighted along plumb lines, and measured distances with lengths of rope marked at intervals. These were methods available to skilled builders of the time and produced consistent, repeatable curves. When the skeleton looked solid, planking began. Planks were laid longitudinally and overlapped or edge-joined depending on the technique chosen. Where the Bible states the ark was sealed with pitch or bitumen, it makes clear that roofing the vessel was not a Untold affair.
Bitumen is a heavy, tar-like substance that, when heated and combined with fillers, forms a viscous waterproofing layer. Applying it required fire, vats, stirring, and a level of patience and caution. In a plausible reconstruction, bitumen would be heated in a low, controlled fire until it flowed, then doused with organic fibers or ash to thicken and form a more stable matrix. It would be applied in successive layers, both on the outside and on internal seams, allowing drying and adherence between coats. The smell would be sharp, smoky, resinous. The workers would wipe and scrape and test for leaks with buckets of water. The text's insistence on coating the ark suggests no one knew that waterproofing was non-negotiable. This was literally a life or death membrane. A few technical words are useful here. The keel, already mentioned, is the spine. Ribs are the frames giving the hull shape. When builders speak of male and female joints, they mean a tongue on one piece and a matching groove on the other, an interlocking connection. Pegs are wooden dowels hammered through to secure joints. These are simple devices, but when used at scale, they create strong, predictable structures. Interior organization is where the ark becomes not just a boat, but a floating ark of preservation. The Hebrew term, often translated as rooms or compartments, implies internal subdivision. Think of a large barn divided into pens and storehouses stacked across 3 levels. A reasonable arrangement would prioritize balance. Heavier animals and bulk feed placed low and near the center line to maintain a low center of gravity, lighter birds and small mammals higher up. Animals that might panic easily would be placed near the family's quarters for calmer handling. Each compartment would need ventilation, access for feeding, and containment to prevent animals from roaming freely in ways that would endanger other creatures or the structure. Managing air and waste inside a closed wooden box required clever measures. Ventilation could be accomplished with a continuous side opening near the top. The scripture says there was a window or opening. Practically, that opening could be channeled with internal baffles that allow fresh air to flow while reducing direct wind-driven water ingress. Small ducts or chimneys could serve purely as ventilation shafts. Warm, moist air rises and can be vented through capped openings. Drainage is also important. Slight inclines in deck beams and small scuppers, simple drains, would let fluids move toward designated sumps where slops could be collected and tossed overboard. Hay and bedding might be sloped and raked to a central chute leading to the lower deck for removal. None of this is spelled out in Scripture. These elements are a plausible reconstruction based on the practical needs of keeping many animals nourished, dry, and separated. Food storage becomes a logistics problem of supply and rotation. Grain, dried fruits, pickled or smoked meats, and seeds would be stored in sealed containers, large woven baskets, clay jars, wooden bins, stacked in dry compartments above the lowest animal pens to protect them from moisture and rodents. Water could be stored in jars and skins. Rain caught through the top opening during construction could be conserved and rationed carefully. Noah and his family would have had to establish feeding routines to conserve energy and to prevent spoilage. Rations would be calculated by species, weight, and expected duration. The idea that Noah and his sons had to become animal keepers and storemen as well as shipwrights adds a human dimension. Long work days, the smell of hay and animals, the constant counting and observation. Sanitation is a detail often left out of dramatic retellings but crucial for survival. Waste management would likely combine containment and composting. Areas dedicated to manure could be piled in containers and periodically moved and vented to dry. Ash and lime, if available, can reduce odors and slow bacterial growth. Fresh bedding swapped for damp bedding, regular turning, and storing manure in sealed pits would reduce disease risk. Again, these are reasonable methods rooted in practices that small-scale herders and barnkeepers used for millennia. The door is a focal point both practically and theologically. Scripture is clear that the ark had a door in its side, and later that God closed that door. From a shipbuilding point of view, a side door in a large hull is a structural vulnerability unless properly reinforced. A plausible reconstruction imagines a massive framed opening with diagonal bracing to resist racking forces. The door itself could be a sliding or pivoting structure set on a robust wooden track or a pivot pin set into strong posts. A pivot system would allow the door to be closed securely from within, perhaps with heavy bars or wedges.
The jambs, the vertical supports of the door, would be scarfed into larger timbers and pegged to the ribs to distribute load. For security against water pressure, the door could be backed with internal battens to press it into a housing and sealed with additional layers of bitumen and rope caulking. Importantly, while these methods are plausible, Scripture tells us the decisive act of shutting is God's. Noah did the building, and the Lord performed the sealing in his timing. The arrival of animals is one of the most striking aspects of the story. The Bible frames this as divine orchestration. Animals came to Noah. From a strictly naturalistic vantage, we might puzzle at the logistics, but the text places agency with God. That theological point remains central. Practically, Noah's family would have prepared pens and gates and kept pathways clear once the animals began to arrive. Domestic species could be let in by people. Many wild animals being present as well implies a restraint or compulsion beyond ordinary behavior.
Whether animals arrived in pairs or in kinds, a biblical phrase sometimes interpreted as families rather than modern species, Noah would still face the challenge of housing and caring for a highly diverse menagerie. This reinforces the portrait of Noah not only as builder, but as steward. When the waters came, the biblical sequence has two major markers that are worth holding: 40 days of rain, and then a period where the waters prevailed, totaling 150 days from the first rising. The text also speaks of the fountains of the deep opening, a phrase that suggests subterranean waters upwelling, not just rain from the heavens. For life inside the ark, that meant the onset of storm and pressure that no wood shipwright could fully predict. Inside, the soundscape would be intense: the first steady beat of heavy rain, the constant roar of a rising flood, timbers creaking under wet loads, animals uneasy but corralled, and the low murmur of human voices praying and working. For Noah and his household, faith and endurance became daily realities. They fed, comforted, cleaned, and listened for signs of change in the world beyond the planking. Balance and seaworthiness matter. A vessel without ballast and proper load distribution can roll or flex dangerously. Some reconstructions suggest that the ark's box-like shape is more stable in turbulent waters than a sleek hull in some conditions. It resists capsize because of its enormous width-to-length ratio and high internal buoyancy. The ark, as specified, would ride high and present a lot of surface to waves, but the internal partitioning and careful stowing of heavy supplies low would mitigate dangerous motion. These are engineering inferences consistent with the dimensions given, not archaeological certainties. Plausible reconstruction. After months at sea, the story turns toward land. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Scripture implies a period of waiting after the rain ceased, during which water levels gradually receded. The scene when Noah sent out a raven and then a dove is intimate and human. The dove's return with an olive leaf signals a significant change. Vegetation appeared again, and the earth began to receive sunlight and air. When the family finally opened the door, the world smelled different. Damp soil, new green, the sharp smell of mountain air after long confinement. They offered sacrifice and gratitude, and God made a covenant sealed with a sign, the rainbow, promising no such universal flood again. Theologically, the ark becomes a symbol of preservation through obedience. Practically, it becomes the starting point for rebuilding. Throughout this reconstruction, one theme holds: obedience expressed in labor. Noah's faith was not idle. The narrative consistently ties the building to obedience. When God speaks, Noah prepares timber and fits pegs. The long, disciplined task of cutting, hauling, shaping, and waterproofing becomes an act of worship.
The mockery of neighbors is a backdrop that highlights perseverance. In a world where many dismissed warning, Noah's hands were busy. His work was testimony. It is important to underline the boundaries of what we are describing. Everywhere the Bible is explicit: dimensions, cypress wood, 3 stories, bitumen covering, a side door, the divine act of closing the door, 40 days of rain, the 150 days of prevailing waters, the landing on Ararat, the dove with the olive leaf. We accept those statements as the narrative backbone. Where the text is silent, the steps we've traced are labeled as plausible reconstructions, informed by building practice in antiquity, constrained by the biblical facts, and respecting limits on what can be claimed as historical proof. Nothing in this reconstruction requires exotic or anachronistic technology. It relies on human skill, endurance, and a few timeless tools of leverage and joinery. What should a viewer take away from this blend of timber and theology? First, the ark is both an engineering response and a theological sign.
The technical choices reflect wisdom in making a structure that could float, safeguard life, and survive enormous stresses. The spiritual choices reflect obedience, a covenantal trust in God's instructions. That combination is the deeper secret. God's plan required human hands willing to do the work. Finally, the Ark story does not end when the boat lands. It continues in the renewal of land, in the family that steps out to cultivate and repopulate, and in the covenantal promise God gave. If this reconstruction has sparked questions about how life resumed on Earth after the flood, or about the larger cultural and ecological consequences of the event, there's a companion video exploring what happened after they left the Ark. Watch that next to follow the narrative from timber and tar into new cultivation, fresh pots of food, and the first sacrifices on a cleansed Earth. If you found this exploration helpful, consider subscribing for more careful, reverent reconstructions of biblical events.